Hello, everyone. My name is Shamta Hunter, and on behalf of the UBC Sustainability Initiative, I'd like to welcome you to UBC Reads Sustainability. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, unceded, and ancestral land of the Musqueam peoples. Also, to let you know that after the main talk, there will be some time for questions. When you are lining up for the question, please use one of those mics on the floor, and the main floor right here. Please note that the event has been video recorded and live streamed, so you would be on camera when you're asking questions. Also, please turn off all your electronic devices at this time. Thank you. Also, Naomi has agreed to stay afterwards to sign some books, and the UBC bookstore is outside selling some of her books as well. Now, I would like to invite Dr. James Tansey to the stage to welcome Naomi Klein. James is an associate professor leading the Sauder School of Business Activities on Sustainability and Social Innovation. James is the executive director of the UBC Sustainability Initiative, as well as of Sauder S3I, Sauder Center for Social Innovation and Impact Investing at the Sauder School of Business. James's research activities cover a number of areas, including social enterprise, climate change, the social impacts of acceptability of new technologies. He is also the founder and CEO of Nature Bank, and a natural capital investment company, and the official supplier of carbon offsets to the 2010 Winter Olympic Games, the first time in history that event has been carbon neutral. James?
I hate hearing that bio because it reminds me I have too many jobs. Welcome all of you today to this very special event with our guest speaker, Naomi Klein. And I would also like to acknowledge that we're in the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people. Many of you know UBC has been a leader in climate change activities for the last 15 years. And we're very proud to announce earlier this year that we hit a 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions on the campus from a 2007 baseline from a program that started in 2010. So demonstrating that some of the kind of dramatic changes in infrastructure and buildings and energy management that are required to tackle climate change have been achievable on a campus with 60,000 people on it. So it's very much looking forward to hearing Naomi's talk today. I've been following Naomi's work since 2000 when I was inspired to read No Logo, and she's been extremely productive since then. The most recent book, which is the focus of today's talk, is This Changes Everything, Capitalism versus the Climate. But many of you will also be familiar with the shock doctrine, the rise of natural capitalism. And if you haven't read No Logo, because it was published in 2000, I'd strongly recommend going back to read that. She's a columnist for The Nation magazine and The Guardian newspaper, and contributing editor to Harper's Magazine. Also a member of the board of directors for 350.org, which is, many of you know, is an organization that's been very active on this campus around issues related to divestment. So the most recent book, This Changes Everything, was the 2014 winner of the Hillary Weston Writers Trust Prize. Was named onto multiple best book lists for 2014, including the New York Times list. I could go through the lengthy accolades, but I think what you're really here to is to hear from Naomi directly. So please join me in welcoming Naomi to the stage.
Hi, everyone. I am very delighted to be here on unceded Coast Salish territory. I want to recognize the elders, past and present, who are with us today, including two from the Littlewat Nation. And I also want to say that while it is so important that we acknowledge that we are on unceded territory, we need to do more than acknowledge it. We have to start acting like it. We need to fight for the laws and policies that reflect the reality that this is land that has never been ceded. That's part of what I'm going to be touching on today in my talk, and hopefully we can get deeper into it in the discussion. Thank you, Dr. James Tansey, for that lovely introduction, for all of your work, for bringing me here to be part of UBC Reads Sustainability. I also want to thank Shamta Hunter for being just an excellent and lovely host, and all of you for tearing yourselves away from the sparkling sunshine and blooming cherry blossoms that I know that you can't possibly be blasé about, to talk about the climate crisis. Now, some of you may be thinking, that's silly. Why would we even talk about the climate crisis when our politicians fixed it already in December in Paris at the big summit to save the world, right? I'm sure you remember all of them cheering wildly for themselves. They were so happy. Remember that? Remember? We're back. And even our usually cynical corporate media couldn't help getting in on the euphoria. I mean, look at some of these headlines. My favorite one, that the deal marked the end of the fossil fuel era. And I'm sure many of you noticed the gas stations closing in droves all over Vancouver, right? And the fact that the front pages of our newspapers are still crowded with stories about new tar sands pipelines that they want to build and new LNG terminals that they want to build, that's all some massive typo, right? Because the era of fossil fuels is over. At least it would need to be if we are going to make good on the targets that our government set in Paris. So what is going on? Is what happened in Paris this landmark political breakthrough of historic proportions, or is it an ecological disaster that is going to keep us hooked to the stuff that is causing the climate crisis? And the short answer to that question is both. It is a diplomatic breakthrough of a kind we haven't seen before. It is very hard to get so many governments to agree on anything. It was very good that countries like the US and China didn't spend the whole time pointing fingers at each other, but actually agreed to a framework. That matters, and it is still an ecological disaster if we don't do a lot better. And that's the paradox of the moment we're in right now, and this is sort of at the center of the thesis of the This Changes Everything project, is that we have waited so long to take climate change seriously that now the things we need to do if we are going to prevent catastrophic warming present fundamental challenges to our economic and political system, challenges our current leaders are not willing to really face up to. And they are willing to do some things, but not enough. So that is the contradiction of the moment, and it's why if we want to prevent climate change, we are going to need some pretty deep system change. So I want to unpack a little bit about what is good about what happened in Paris and what is missing and what still needs to be done, okay? Because I don't think we can dismiss it all by any means, and I'm not suggesting that we do so. So the most significant part of what happened in Paris, and I was fortunate enough to be there for the whole negotiations, is that the final agreement, the Paris Accord, that is going to be officially signed at the end of next week, states that governments commit to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius while pursuing, quote, efforts to limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees Celsius, okay? So, when you talk about anything having to do with the UN, it's this, number soup and acronym hell, and it's really easy to just tune it all out, right? So I want to unpack why it matters that it says 1.5 in the text of the Paris Accord, because it really does matter. And it was a fight. It was a really big fight to get that number in the agreement. Because at the beginning, it looked like it was going to be a commitment to keep temperatures to 2 degrees warming. And there was a huge amount of pressure coming from the governments of the countries that are most vulnerable to climate change. So countries like the Philippines that are already getting battered by super typhoons like Haiyan, countries like Bolivia that depend on glaciers for their fresh water in large cities like La Paz, and those glaciers are disappearing. and watching them disappear over their cities. And it's a demand that has been coming from Africa, particularly southern Africa, since the Copenhagen meeting in 2009, which set 2 degrees as the target. When that happened, and I was in Copenhagen in 2009, there was a spontaneous demonstration of the African delegates in Copenhagen who called a 2-degree temperature target a death sentence for Africa, because they said that if we allow temperatures to increase by that much, in Africa it would translate to 3 degrees of warming or even 3.5 degrees of warming, and huge parts of the continent would become uninhabitable. The other place where you heard a demand for a more ambitious target than 2 degrees was from low-lying Pacific Island states, right, who know that 2 degrees warming means that their countries disappear beneath the waves. So they've been fighting very hard for 1.5 to be the target. And it's no guarantee that the very low-lying nations will survive, but it gives them a fighting chance. And the slogan of the low-lying Pacific Island nations, like the Marshall Islands and the Maldives, has been 1.5 to stay alive. And one of the voices that has been most eloquent and most powerful in making the argument for 1.5 is a poet from the Marshall Islands, a young woman named Kathy Jetner-Kajener. She, you may have seen her in this video that went viral when she read a poem to the United Nations. She was speaking on behalf of Pacific Island nations, and she came up a year and a half ago at the UN and read this poem, and then her daughter, who was then 9 months old, came up on stage. It was sort of a letter to her daughter, this poem promising that they would fight, that they wouldn't drown. So Kathy was in Paris. I was lucky enough to meet her at a mock trial we put on, that 350 put on, a mock trial of Exxon, and Kathy was one of the witnesses. So, many of you will recall that Canada did something really quite remarkable in Paris. Our new government decided to stand with these very vulnerable countries and argue that 1.5 should be in the text of the agreement. And Canada was the only wealthy, highly industrialized country to do that, to stand with countries like the Marshall Islands and say, yeah, 2 degrees isn't good enough. We have to say 1.5. And that's part of the reason, a big part of the reason, why that is in the agreement. So, I was reminded of the human stakes of these numbers just a couple of weeks ago. I follow Kathy on Twitter now, and she sent out this tweet after a storm hit the Marshall Islands. This just went out. High tides have hit Marshall Islands again. This is our seawall getting beat up. 1.5 to stay alive. So it is good, it matters that 1.5 is in the text of the Paris Agreement. That is why partially there was so much euphoria at the end. It's also why we saw those over-the-top headlines that this would mark the end of the fossil fuel era, because if we're serious about that target, we really do have to get off fossil fuels right away, and we have to be completely off them by mid-century. So if we took these targets seriously, those headlines would be true. So here's the bad news. At the same time as our governments set these targets, set these noble goals, they simultaneously and very openly declared themselves completely unwilling to do the things necessary to meet those goals, which takes a little bit of explaining. The way this process worked is that governments were not told what their share of the global carbon budget would be if we want to keep these targets, if we want to keep to these temperature targets. Instead, we took a voluntary approach. The top-down regulatory approach was dismissed, and we took this voluntary approach, which meant that every government had to go home and come up with their own emission reduction pledges and plans, and then bring them all together in Paris, add them up, and the idea was, fingers crossed, that what each country, Canada, the US, China, every country who's party to this, that each country's emission reduction plan would add up to the goal that was set for keeping temperatures down. The problem is, if you add up all of these plans that each country brought, they're called INDCs, it doesn't add up to a carbon budget compatible with 2 degrees warming or 1.5 degrees warming. It adds up to 3 to 4 degrees of warming, okay? So to put that in perspective, at the beginning of This Changes Everything, I quote one of the world's leading experts on emission reduction, Kevin Anderson, who is the Deputy Director of the Tyndall Centre on Climate Change Research in Manchester. Anderson says that 4 degrees warming is incompatible with any reasonable characterization of an organized, equitable, and civilized global community. So, what we have in Paris is a pretty good definition of safety, 1.5 warming, coupled with a concrete plan for disaster, national plans that actually bring us to 3 to 4 degrees of warming. So what our governments have said is, we know what we need to do, and we are willing to do roughly half that, okay? But it's actually even a little bit more worrying than that, because well, first of all, they don't have a plan for how they're going to bridge this gap. They recognize that the gap is there, but the only thing in the text that deals with how we're going to confront this problem, this gap between what the plans are and what the goal is it says that governments will meet every 5 years, take stock, and hope that things have changed for the better. Like, who knows, right? Maybe Donald Trump will be willing to make deeper emission cuts than Obama. And I wouldn't hold your breath that Hillary Clinton would be willing to make deeper emission cuts than Obama either. The reason why it's even more worrying than that, sorry, I won't make you look at that for too much longer, is that these nationally determined plans that are called INDCs are non-binding. So the I in INDC stands for intended, right? So the plans that every government brought to Paris can be broken, right? So Canada brought a plan, and we actually know that we are on target to blow it, even though these were Harper's commitments that the Trudeau government brought to Paris. We found out afterwards that we don't have the policies in place in Canada to lower emissions as much as we promised to do in Paris, and those are already inadequate. And this is the reason why Republican candidates running for president right now are all promising that they won't keep to Obama's commitments that he brought to Paris, because this is not a legally binding treaty, right? So if we break it, if we break the commitments, there are no repercussions, there aren't going to be fines, there aren't going to be sanctions like happens if you break a corporate trade agreement, for instance. So the road we're on doesn't lead to 3 or 4 degrees warming, which is dangerous enough. The road we're on, which in the climate modeling is called business as usual, actually leads to 6 degrees of warming. So just to put that in perspective, we have so far warmed the planet by 1 degree Celsius. And we're defining dangerous warming as almost double that, if it's 2 degrees, right? Now, and let's think about what 1 degrees warming looks like. This is what it looked like last month in the Northwest Territories. That is a tanker truck carrying petrol that is falling through the melting ice. And I find that an interesting image because obviously there's a relationship between what that truck is carrying and what is happening to the ice. But of course, in all of the reporting about this incident, those connections were not made and climate change wasn't even mentioned. Are we stopping, despite the fact that the road we're on is melting? Well, there's no sign of that. And it's very important to recognize that while this is what climate change looks like in the north, it looks very different in different parts of the world. And the impacts of climate change play out very, very unequally, including in our own country. But particularly globally, and this is a really disturbing image from the heat wave that hit India and Pakistan this past summer. And I show this image because it received very little media attention. Thousands of people died in the midst of this heat wave that the Indian government identified as being directly linked to climate change. This is a morgue in Karachi that ran out of space in the midst of the heat wave. And now Pakistan is dealing with torrential flooding And 45 people died in the midst of those floods just this week. So you can understand why not everybody was cheering at the end of the climate summit, why James Hansen, perhaps the world's leading climate scientist, called the deal a fraud, a fake really. It's just words, because it is not going to get us off that road in and of itself. And this is why our leaders felt able to go from that sort of self-congratulation fest to coming home and pushing for new tar sands pipelines and new LNG terminals. And I want to be clear, the Trudeau government is doing a lot of good stuff on the climate file. They've just announced some really important commitments around methane reduction and Arctic protection, and Rachel Notley's government in Alberta has introduced some really important improvements to their regulatory structure. They're doing some really, really good work in Alberta on the coal phase out, but all of this is undone by this absurd and dangerous idea that we hear from both the Alberta government and the federal government that these actions somehow grant a license to build new tar sands pipelines and expand tar sands productions. They do not. The science is very, very clear that the numbers don't add up. We cannot keep to these commitments and expand the tar sands at the same time. New pipelines like Energy East and pipelines expansions like the Trans Mountain expansion are intimately tied to increases in production in the Alberta tar sands. And they also lock us in for decades into the future into this particular model, right? The Energy East pipeline that they want to build through Quebec, the price tag on this pipeline now is $15.7 billion. You don't spend nearly $16 billion building a pipeline if you do not intend for that pipeline to continue to function for 40 years. I mean, if you look at the business plans for all of these mega infrastructure projects, they're built to last for many, many decades, past the point that we need to be off fossil fuels. And that's why the key point here is infrastructure lock-in. That is what the International Energy Agency is focused on. There's a new study that just came out last week from a group of Oxford scientists, which very clearly states that starting next year, every new power plant in the world needs to be carbon neutral, okay? So all new infrastructure that gets built cannot lock us in to a future of fossil fuels. We need to build the infrastructure of the future. So, if there's one thing we know about our new Prime Minister, it's that he is the kind of politician that wants everyone to like him. So he wants to say yes to everything. And when he was in Vancouver here last month for the Globe Conference, he said we can have windmills and pipelines, right? We can use the pipelines to pay for the windmills. And that's a very attractive idea for 20 years ago. It is not an idea that works today. Not if we have any intention of making good on the pledges that we made in Paris. These are sacred pledges that mean survival to entire nations, to people like Kathy and her daughter in the Marshall Islands. To treat those pledges as if they can be broken so casually is a moral abomination, and we simply cannot let them do it. Our government went to Paris and said to the world 1.5, and our job is to hold them to it. It is not to allow them to rebrand Stephen Harper's climate criminality, paint it green, so that we all feel better about ourselves. We need to bury that legacy once and for all, along with a whole lot of unburnable carbon. So that is precisely what is happening across this continent, in the streets, in the woods, and around the world. Politicians may not have the guts to stand up to big oil, but regular people all around the world are doing just that. It's a movement that some people call blockadia, and it is very strong in this part of the world. Here are some recent highlights. This is what happened when Shell was on its way up to do exploratory drilling in the Alaskan Arctic this past spring. They decided to bring their giant rig to Seattle to do some maintenance, and they were greeted by kayaktivists, a new word. And then that rig actually traveled very slowly along the Sunshine Coast. and was greeted. That's Audrey Siegel, an amazing Indigenous activist from here in Vancouver. And a few months later, Shell announced that it was pulling out of the Arctic for the foreseeable future. In every single one of these fights, yes. In every single one of these fights, First Nations are leading the way, and women are on the front lines. This is another unforgettable image. That's Amanda Polkes confronting the RCMP during the Elsipogtog standoff. And now there is a moratorium on fracking in New Brunswick, one that is unstable, that people have to fight to protect, but it's an example, another example of how this kind of activism is leading to changes in policy. A little example closer to home. And of course, key battles are playing out in the courts as well, including the Inuit community of Clyde River, which has been taking on Arctic drilling for oil. Their case is now going all the way to the Supreme Court. So there is a lot going on, and there is more to come. You know, there are all these struggles, these Blockadia struggles are very local, and they are driven by a love of place and local communities coming together to protect the water, to protect the land. But they are happening with a deep awareness that they are part of a global movement that in protecting the local, in protecting the water and the land in our local communities, we are protecting the stability of the entire planet, our collective home in the process. And we're going to see a very vivid example of the global nature of Blockadia next month when there's a wave of actions happening around the world under the banner of Break Free from Fossil Fuels. The strategy for this campaign is to go after the biggest pools of carbon that simply cannot be dug up. They have to stay in the ground if we are going to keep to the commitments that we made in Paris. So there's going to be simultaneous actions in May in India, in Australia, in Germany, Indonesia, and of course here in Canada, focused on our carbon bomb, the tar sands. So on one side of the country, there are going to be actions that are focused on Energy East, mostly in Quebec. And right here in Vancouver, on May 13th and 14th, there's going to be some really exciting actions focused on stopping the Kinder Morgan pipeline expansion. It's happening at a really key moment just before the NEB, the National Energy Board, comes out with its recommendations for the project, and the federal government will just be starting its additional review of the pipeline. So it's a really key moment for people to get out there and send a very clear message about the need to stay true to the Paris Pledge and stopping tar sands expansion. There are other big Blockadia struggles in this province, particularly around Site C. And if you guys want to find out more about Break Free, go to CanadaBreakFree2016.org. Another big development in this movement is the rise of fossil fuel divestment. Are there any divestment activists who came out today? A couple. The past 2 years have seen exponential growth in this tactic, and I was, as you heard, I'm on the board of directors of 350.org, and this is a relatively new tactic, right? There had been a couple of divestment campaigns focused exclusively on coal at U.S. universities like Swarthmore, but there was not a movement that was calling for divestment from the fossil fuel sector as a whole as recently as 4 years ago. So where this movement comes from is research. It comes from research that was done in the UK by the Carbon Tracker Institute. And this was research that was really shocking to a lot of us. What they did is they looked at all of the proven fossil fuel reserves that are counted already towards the stock prices of fossil fuel companies. This is carbon that is already part of the market. It hasn't been dug up, but it is part of the reserves of the fossil fuel industry. And what they did is they compared all that carbon to what the carbon budget is if we want to keep temperatures below 2 degrees warming. And what they found is that there is already 5 times more carbon in the proven fossil fuel reserves than is compatible with that 2-degree temperature target. In other words, the business model of this sector is at war with life on Earth. And that's where the tactic of divesting from fossil fuels came from. And it's been growing with stunning speed. Now 500 institutions with assets worth $3.4 trillion have committed to divest. We're talking about universities, cities, towns, churches, foundations. The movement has really been emboldened by, once again, fantastic research that has come out in recent months, done by Inside Climate News, the LA Times, the Columbia School of Journalism, that has uncovered information in a cache of documents that Exxon was doing cutting-edge climate research dating back to the 1970s, that Exxon was using its own tankers in the late 70s and early 80s to take CO2 measurements in the ocean and air, and then was publishing these findings in cutting-edge peer-reviewed journals, and then proceeded to fund the disinformation campaign. Starting in the 1990s, Exxon was a major funder of climate change denial, and stood in the way of important legislation, including lobbying very, very actively against the US signing the Kyoto Protocol, right? So this creates a really important direct analogy really with the tobacco companies, right? Which have also been a successful target for divestment, because what we found out was that people understood there was a connection between smoking and cancer, but what really became explosive for the tobacco companies was discovering that they had done their own research definitively linking smoking and cancer, but then had funded all of this misinformation, often through the same think tanks as the fossil fuel companies, to say, well, the science isn't in. And so that was the thing that really turned it around for tobacco companies, not just for divestment, but also for introducing legislation to impose very strong taxes on tobacco products, to use that money to do education campaigns, to tell people to quit smoking, to pay for the impacts of smoking, and that's exactly what we need to do with fossil fuels. And I think that you are starting to see something really exciting where, I don't know, have people seen some of these videos of young people confronting Hillary Clinton on the campaign trail about the fact that she takes money from fossil fuel companies, her family foundation takes money, and her super PAC takes money from registered fossil fuel lobbyists, and she's been getting very upset about this. But what's really been striking to me is that the young people who are doing this, they all come from the fossil fuel divestment movement on their campuses in the United States, right? And so it's a logical conclusion to say, well, if my school shouldn't take money from fossil fuels, then our politicians shouldn't take money from fossil fuels either. So we're seeing a real evolution in the movement. It's getting a lot more political. And unfortunately, we don't yet have a major Canadian university to add to this list. Our top institutions, not only UBC, but also McGill and the University of Toronto, have flatly refused to divest. And I think this is a real shame for our country. Luckily, a lot of students are not taking no for an answer. And here in Vancouver, UBC 350 organizers behind the Divest UBC campaign are regrouping, and it is not the last you have heard from them. So there is a lot happening, and we are getting better and better at saying no to this doubling down on the fossil fuel economy, and that's a lot of progress, but it also isn't enough, because saying no does cause pain. It has implications for workers, it has implications for communities, so we can't just say no. This can't just be a movement of no's. It has to also be a movement with fully articulated yeses about the economy that we want instead, about what the post-extractive economy looks like. And it also has to be a movement that recognizes that we live in a time of multiple overlapping crises. Yes, climate change is a crisis, but so is joblessness, so is exclusion from the economy, so is institutionalized racism, so is the burning need for justice for Indigenous people in this country, and on and on. So we need to find policies that solve multiple problems at once. We need policies that bring emissions down very quickly in line with science, that simultaneously create huge numbers of well-paying jobs, and that bring justice to the communities that need it most, indeed begin to heal the wounds that date back to our country's founding. And I believe that we're starting to get closer to that yes. We have some examples of the kinds of policies that deliver these multiple wins, not the sort of corporate win-wins of like the fossil fuel companies win supposedly and emissions go down, but really communities win. And a fantastic example of this has been Germany's energy transition. Germany has been moving very quickly towards renewable energy. They're now getting 30% of their electricity from renewables, much of it decentralized. And the part of it that I find really exciting is that in switching from nuclear and increasingly from coal to renewable energy, Germans are changing the ownership structures of how energy is generated. So in the process of this transition, we have seen an explosion of energy cooperatives. Germany has 900 new energy cooperatives, and in 200 cities and towns, they have decided to reverse the privatization of their energy grids that happened in previous decades. So they're taking back ownership of their energy grids as they switch to 100% renewables. And what this means is that not only are they able to begin to lower emissions, they've also created huge numbers of jobs, 400,000 jobs as part of this transition. But also, as they generate energy, they're keeping the profits from that energy generation in communities so that they can pay for services, right? So you have this triple win of fighting austerity, joblessness, and climate change if we do it right. We need this shift on a global scale. And what is exciting about the moment in which we find ourselves is that the time for this transition has never been better. We are in the midst of a renaissance of renewable energy. Prices are plummeting. The cost of solar is down by 75% over 7 years. Efficiency is improving. We have fantastic new research out of Stanford University led by Mark Jacobson. He's an engineer with a team, a big team behind him. If you want to know more about it, you can go to solutions.org. What Jacobson has been showing is that every country in the world can get to 100% renewable energy with existing technologies by mid-century. And he's now broken this down specifically for Canada and the US. He's broken it down state by state. So more and more the movements that are saying no to fracking, no to tar sands pipelines, are simultaneously laying out a roadmap for how those communities can get to 100% renewables, how they can create jobs in their communities, how they can't just be the no people. So how are we going to do a kind of German-style transition on a global scale? In an ideal world, we would be doing this just because we're scared of the implications of climate change. But it is clear here in Canada that is not going to be enough. People are enjoying their warm winters a little bit too much. And the truth is, climate change doesn't really play out as a sort of shock to the system that grabs people's attention and says, we have to act, right? It sort of plays out in the background as this kind of slow grind. A disorientation, is this really right? What's going on? And it has a lot of trouble competing with the many more urgent crises that we have in front of us. So in Germany, what's interesting, one of the things that's most interesting about the transition there is that it had already started, but it was going quite slowly. The real catalyst where things started really speeding up happened 5 years ago, and the catalyst was this. It was the Fukushima disaster. So it wasn't in Germany, but because Germany is very reliant on nuclear power, when they saw what happened with the Fukushima disaster, that became a real catalyst for the environmental movement in Germany to demand a much more rapid transition to renewable energy. So that was their wake-up call for them. And I think it's going to be a different wake-up call for different countries. What's going to be ours? What's going to be our wake-up call in Canada where we just go, you know what? The current system isn't working. We need to change. What is going to be our wake-up call if it isn't going to be climate change? Could it be this? That is the price of oil. That is the price of oil dropping from $100 a barrel to below $30 a barrel. This is a shock to our system. Shocks come in many shapes and forms. But when you bet your economy on a single volatile economy, as our former government did, and then this happens, that's a big shock. We're already seeing political implications. Remember Jim Prentice? Remember Stephen Harper? They lost their jobs because of this chart. Investors are pulling out of big fossil fuel projects in droves. The LNG terminals that the government here has been so keen to build, some of these are not happening because of this. And of course, we're seeing it most dramatically in Alberta. And the human suffering is enormous. And our hearts should go out to the tens of thousands of Alberta families who have been abandoned by the oil and gas industry. And of course, the human impacts of this chart are not just in Alberta. They're happening all over the country, and they're certainly happening in this province, where kids are going to school hungry because one of their parents lost a contract job in the oil patch in Alberta, and they had no severance, and they were carrying a huge and unsustainable mortgage. And a lot of people aren't talking about this because it's happened so suddenly, and there's a lot of shame associated with seeing your income drop this suddenly and this dramatically. We are in an economic shock in this country. The extractive economy is failing us on multiple levels, and it calls for a bold response. But what is going to be the nature of that bold response? It is absolutely critical that we don't respond to this by just trying to resuscitate the old, failing fossil fuel economy. The answer to, in a crisis like this is to leap to the next economy now, to use this as our catalyst. We need to treat climate change like the emergency that it is and spend public money to get off fossil fuels, transform our energy grid, make massive investments in transit, in rail, in local agriculture. This can be the biggest job creation program we have seen in decades, and we can do it in a way that delivers meaningful justice to First Nations and reduces economic and racial inequality in this country. It's possible, and I want to talk about how we can do that. But before that, I want to just talk a little bit about some of the things I'm concerned about already with what we're seeing from this government. I think it's fantastic that Trudeau ran on a platform of economic stimulus, that he's not afraid of running a deficit. But what I'm worried about is a repeat of something we saw in 2009 when Barack Obama came to power in the midst of an economic crisis with the banks failing. He had the ability to write a very large stimulus check, much as Trudeau does in this moment. He had the auto companies failing. There were bailouts for the auto companies. And he also had a mandate to act on climate change. But unfortunately, all these different mandates, the need to do something about the economic crisis, to do something for the auto sector, and to do something about climate change, were treated as separate discussions. It wasn't a holistic vision for how we solve multiple problems at once. So if you look at what Obama did with the stimulus bill, he did spend some money on renewable energy. He did some very good things in that area, but the biggest winner were roads. The biggest winner was the fossil fuel economy. And if you look at what they did with the auto companies, they bailed them out, but they didn't use it as an opportunity to change the nature of that sector, so that they're producing huge numbers of electric vehicles, so that they're building more vehicles for public transit. We didn't bring those conversations together. So my worry in this moment is that we have a government that will respond to the economic crisis by doubling down on the old economy rather than jolting us to the next economy. And here are the signs that I'm worried about. In this new budget that's come down, we have $3.4 billion for public transit over 3 years, which sounds like a lot of money, but to put that in perspective, Toronto alone, our TTC, our public transit system, has a $3 billion backlog just in repairs, right? So $3.4 billion nationally over 3 years is not going to change the way Canadians move themselves around, which is what we need to do in the face of the climate crisis. Other concerning parts of the budget are that they've broken their promise to cut fossil fuel subsidies. And in fact, the subsidies for LNG are specifically extended until 2024, which is absurd. And then there's the Bombardier bailout. And now if this goes ahead at a federal level, Bombardier is going to get and if you include what Quebec has already given Bombardier, they would get $3.4 billion in bailout funds. And I'm not arguing that they shouldn't get a bailout, but if you look at Bombardier as a whole, this is a company that produces all kinds of things. They produce planes, but they also produce trains, high-speed trains, but they don't sell them in Canada. They sell them in Europe, they sell them in Asia. So if this company needs our help, why wouldn't we use this moment to say, we want high-speed trains in Canada, and that's where we want our public dollars to go. Instead, the bailout is going to the commercial jets division. So it is the maximum carbon emissions per public dollar. We have other examples of this. The Premier of Saskatchewan is calling for $130 million to go to clean up decommissioned oil wells. We need to clean them up, but it is not the job of taxpayers to do this. We heard from fossil fuel companies for so long that, yeah, don't worry about the mess in the Alberta tar sands. We're going to reclaim that land, and you'll be able to drink the water in the tailings ponds, we were told by the Harper government, right? And now they're looking for a bailout. They want us to pay for the cleanup. And we're talking about the richest industry in the world. If they can't clean up their own mess, I believe that we should expropriate their assets and use it to pay for the transition off of fossil fuels. So here's an idea. Let's stop calling this an economic stimulus. Let's call it and think of it as an economic catalyst. Yes, we need to spend the money, but let's spend it thoughtfully. The old economy that has failed both people on the planet is flatlining. Let's not resuscitate. Let's reimagine. Let's reinvent. Let's use this crisis to leap to the next economy now. So I want to talk a little bit about leaping, and specifically the Leap Manifesto. Some of you, have any of you signed the Leap Manifesto? Can I see a show of hands? Have you signed? We've got a few. Okay, all right, that's good, but that's not enough. You can go to leapmanifesto.org, read it if you like it. You can sign it. So the Leap Manifesto is a document. It's not long, won't take you long to read. It came out of a meeting that we helped host in Toronto last May. It was attended by 60 organizers, leaders, and theorists from movements representing labor, Indigenous rights, climate, migrant rights, anti-poverty, housing rights, faith, women's rights, green tech, the sharing economy. It was this amazing cross-section. And I really want to highlight that there were 60 people locked in a room for 2 days coming up with the framework for this document. And I say this because in a lot of the coverage of the Leap Manifesto, particularly in recent days, I get referred to as the author of the Leap Manifesto, or my partner Avi Lewis gets referred to it. We are 2 of 60 people who were part of this really quite remarkable process. And what we realized when we had this meeting is that we have not, we've had some broad coalitions in this country, in the history of social movements in this country, but it's always been coming together to say no to something, right? So we've had big coalitions that have come together to say no to a new trade agreement, or a big coalition to come together to say no to Harper. But we haven't actually had coalitions that have come together to map out the yes, to say what we want that is better than what we have right now. Not just things not getting worse, but things actually getting better. So the whole thesis around this gathering was that we needed to come up with policies that would solve multiple problems at once, and that would embody a phrase that I first heard from Leanne Simpson, a wonderful Anishinaabe writer that some of you may be familiar with, which is punctuated transformation, that we are in a moment when we can't just do things, solve one problem at a time. We need to solve problems on multiple fronts at once, so punctuated transformation. And my role at this gathering was really just to listen, and to listen to the emerging threads that were coming out, the threads that connected all of these issues. And it was very clear that there was this common theme emerging and identifying problems, which was the logic of the logic of extractivism, which is not just about endlessly extracting finite resources from the earth, but also the way we treat one another, the way we treat workers, this idea that we can take and push as if there is no limits to what workers can handle, and also the way in which we attack the social fabric, the social safety nets, that we can just take from it and cut from it, and it will never break. So seeing that as a common theme, that we need to move from this culture of endless taking to a culture of caretaking, of caring for the planet and also caring for one another, that needs to be the purpose and the centerpiece of the next economy. We came up with this document, and it was signed by almost 200 Canadian organizations, a huge cross-section, everyone from Greenpeace and Oxfam, big groups like that, to Black Lives Matter Toronto, No One is Illegal, and 35,000 Canadians have signed it. And when we launched it during the Toronto International Film Festival, and we were able to announce that people like Ellen Page and Rachel McAdams and Leonard Cohen had signed it. So we got a lot of press attention because of that, because that's what happens when you have celebrities. And the Canadian media responded. So this was a poster designed by Angela Starrett that we launched it with, and our national media responded with a cool head. This was some of the coverage that we got. Yes, a call for Canada's economy to be based on caring for the earth and each other is clearly madness. In the past 7 months, the National Post has written about 30 articles about the Leap, all of them negative, gleefully mischaracterizing it as a nefarious socialist plot inspired by Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward. Because of that, I want to actually share with you the reason why we called it the Leap. We called it the Leap, obviously because the word leap captures this need for a rapid response, for punctuated transformation, but also because we realized that 2016, the year when we would be beginning the fight for this vision, is a leap year. We just added an extra day to February, and we started doing some research about leap years, and they're really interesting, right? So every 4 years, we do this strange thing where we tack on an extra day to our Western calendars. And we do this because our human-created system for measuring time is flawed. It does not actually match up to the Earth's revolution around the sun. And if we don't fix the rules, if we don't course correct, then everything gets upside down and we start having summer and winter, which we're actually already having. Anyway, so it struck us that this was a great metaphor, right? Because Julius Caesar was actually the first one to introduce leap days, and it's a recognition that it is easier to change a human-created system than it is to change the laws of nature. And if our economists understood this, we would actually be in very good shape. So that is why we called it the Leap Manifesto. It begins by acknowledging the original caretakers of the land, water, and air, calls for the full implementation of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People. The centerpiece of the Leap Manifesto is the call for energy democracy inspired by Germany, that as we transition from fossil fuels to renewables, we want to change the ownership structure. We want communities to own and control their own renewable energy projects. But we wanted to do better than energy democracy. We also wanted to call for energy justice and energy reparations. So that's why the Leap states that Indigenous people and others on the front lines of industrial activity should be first to receive public support for their own clean energy projects. And this is inspired by what is already happening in many Indigenous communities. This is Little Buffalo, Lubicon Cree community in the heart of the Alberta tar sands. This is a community that was told, again and again, the only economic opportunities are to go work in the tar sands. And they're proving that claim wrong, and they are providing for their own energy needs through solar. This is happening in many Indigenous communities in this province. In Alberta, the Beaver Lake Cree, Athabasca Chippewa First Nation have all launched solar projects. But what's crazy about this is that getting the funding for these projects is left up to the communities. They have to do Kickstarter campaigns and go to American foundations and divert funds from other essential services to pay for this. And so what we're saying with the Leap Manifesto is this should be policy. This should be policy. This should be taxpayer money as a drop in the ocean of what is owed to Indigenous people in this country. The other point of connection. Another point of connection as we were meeting had to do with the need to build bridges with the migrant rights movement. We were very lucky to have people from No One Is Illegal Coast Salish territory at the meeting, including the wonderful Harsha Walia. And so part of what we do in the document is talk about why it is that so many people are being pushed from their lands and recognizing our collective responsibility because of our government's role in pursuing the wars, the trade agreements, and also the climate disruption that is pushing so many people off of their land, which is why the Leap calls for full rights for all workers, regardless of immigration status, as well as opening our borders to far more migrants and refugees. Yes. So, as you can imagine, as I mentioned earlier, we see this as a job strategy, and we call for those big investments in what you would traditionally think of as a green job. And we know from great research from the CCPA BC office that if you invest in transit, efficiency, and renewable energy, you create 6 to 8 times more jobs than if you build yet another tar sands pipeline. So we call for that, and we call for workers in the tar sands to get the training, the retraining that they need so that they can be a part of this transition and be part of there's a new group that was just launched in the Alberta tar sands, Iron and Earth, a group of tar sands workers for renewable energy calling for 10,000 tar sands workers to be retrained to put up solar panels on public buildings in this country, which is a fantastic proposal. And But the other thing we wanted to do is we wanted to redefine what a climate job is, what a green job is. Yeah, it's guys in hard hats and women in hard hats putting up solar panels. But there is so much low carbon work that is already being done that is not recognized as low carbon work. And that includes the work of land defense. It also includes the work of caregiving, which is why the manifesto says that we must expand those sectors that are already low carbon. Caregiving, teaching, social work, the arts, public interest media. We don't usually recognize this, but teaching and caring for kids doesn't burn much carbon. Nor does caring for the sick, or making art for that matter, which is why it makes no sense that these are the very sectors under relentless attack by cost-cutting politicians. So, all of this costs money. Some cute kids to look at. All of this costs money, which is why we felt that it was absolutely crucial to say something else, which is that in a time of unprecedented private wealth, austerity is a manufactured crisis at war with life on Earth. The money we need is out there, we just have to get at it. So we worked with the wonderful economists at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives to come up with an accompanying document to the Leap called Canada Can Afford to Leap, and it costs out exactly how we're going to get the money to pay for all of this good stuff, including, yes, ending fossil fuel subsidies for real, financial transaction taxes, increased royalties on fossil fuel extraction, higher income taxes for corporations, a progressive carbon tax, cuts to military spending. Sounds a little bit like Bernie Sanders' election campaign, doesn't it? It's all based on a well-established principle that the polluter should pay. So these are the core principles of the just transition. Front lines first, and polluter pays. So there's a lot, and there's a lot more. We talk about how we can't have more trade deals like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, how we need to reimagine how we grow our food, and how we need to have a real debate in this country about a guaranteed annual income. What has been amazing since we launched the Leap Manifesto was watching people pick it up and apply it to where they live and where they work. And one of the most exciting examples of this was launched on Leap Day on February 29th by the Postal Workers Union. And as you know, the post office in this country is very much under threat. The previous government wanted to do away with home delivery altogether. The new government is having a review, and everything is on the table, including going ahead with killing home delivery, including privatization. And the Postal Workers Union has put forward a plan, and we've been working with them, our LEAP team has been working with them on this plan called Delivering Community Power, and they have a different approach. They want to completely reimagine the post office so that it is the hub of this transition to the next economy. Now, they point out something very interesting, which is that there are more post offices in our country than there are Tim Hortons, and that's saying a lot. There's a lot of post offices, and we have this amazing infrastructure, this bricks and mortar infrastructure. It's in almost every community except for where they've been shut down. In lots of communities, all you have is a general store and a post office, and that's downtown, right? So rather than hacking away at this public infrastructure until there's nothing left to defend, which is a Canadian tradition, witness the CBC, they propose doing something else, which is reinventing it. So their plan lays out a vision for the post office, which would have solar panels on the roof, electric charging stations outside. You know, people talk about, well, I can't get an electric car because where will I charge it? Imagine if every post office doubled as a charging station. Made in Canada, electric vehicles delivering the mail. They've been working with Unifor, which represents auto workers, on this plan. And these vehicles wouldn't just be delivering the mail under this plan. The postal fleet would be at the center of the caring economy. Door knocking on elders' homes, which is what postal workers do in Japan, we discovered. Delivering farm-to-table food, as the post office does in parts of France. And perhaps most exciting, the post office could provide affordable community banking, going head-to-head with the exploitive payday loan sector and providing capital and counseling for community-controlled green energy projects. So we've been really, really excited about this project. And yeah, I mean, I know I have this corner. And I say this, if you want to find out more about it, go to Delivering Community Power, or you can find out about it from my website. And you know, there is this review process going on, and our government wants to hear from Canadians about what we think the post office should be. So back up this amazing plan if you like it. There's lots of other examples of people picking up the leap and running with it. This is a rally that took place on Justin Trudeau's first day in office here in Vancouver, organized by the Canadian Union of organized by CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees. There's this amazing group of students up in Nelson, BC, who, this is how they welcomed Trudeau to office. And on Leap Day, they had a 24-hour sit-in, and they're fighting for the Leap because they're fighting for their future. The least Canadian part of all of this has been that people outside of Canada have taken an interest in the Leap, and it has inspired other processes in other countries where people are coming together to write their own Leap-inspired manifestos. In the UK, they came up with a document called The People's Demands. There's a coalition of green parties in Scandinavia that have produced their own manifesto. There's a group in Nunavut that is in the middle of coming up with what an Arctic Leap would look like. And what we're hearing again and again from people who contact us about this is that what they like about the Leap is this sense of both urgency and possibility. Because, you know, we hear so often from our leaders that some half measure is, oh, sure, it's not good enough, and sure, it's completely oblivious to the science, but it's a step in the right direction, right? But the problem is that we now are faced with a chasm between where we are and where we need to be in just a few short years. And when you're faced with a chasm, if you take a small step, even if it's in the right direction, it doesn't end well. And people know it. Our politicians may fear transformational change, but a great many of us out there are hungry for it. We recognize that the system is failing us on multiple fronts. That's why you see a candidate like Bernie Sanders, who, by the way, won the last 4 states by a significant margin, and he's out there. He's out there talking about a system change, right? He's out there talking about a political revolution. And then we've got a pope that sounds and even kind of looks a lot like him, saying very similar things, right? Apparently, a whole lot of us understand that we've gone so far off course, and time is so short that now we have to go for it on all fronts. At this late hour, with so much to lose and so much to gain, now is not the time for small steps. Now is the time for boldness. Now is the time to leap. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you, guys. What a lovely response. Yeah. So how's the Q&A going to work? You're moderating it, right? No. Yeah?
So if you have questions, please, there's a mic right on the floor right here. If you can come up to the mic and ask your questions. I also have a handheld mic, so if you can raise your hand and I can bring the mic to you.
Hi, thanks so much. I have wondered about something that no one talks about. I have recently retired, and everyone is saying, "Oh, are you going to travel now?" And I thought maybe I might take a dream trip to Turkey, to the Byzantine. And I looked into it, and in doing so, I learned that just my part of the journey would drop something like 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide on this precious planet. And I changed my plan. But every day, I see flights going across the sky, and all this white stuff comes out, and it looks so beautiful. And I realize it may look beautiful, but it is causing a disaster. And no one seems to talk about it. And I have friends who travel every few months, every few weeks, here and there, as if there is absolutely no tomorrow. And I wonder what you may have to say about this. You mention it in your book, and I appreciated certainly your book. So thank you. Wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it is, yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that flying is the least sustainable thing we can do, and this is why I was emphasizing the need to invest in public transit and also rail in terms of really revolutionizing the way we move ourselves around in this very, very large country. It's obvious that we're going to have to be living more regionally. But we also can have a system where we are much less reliant on those short-haul flights. And I think that kind of air travel for leisure, as you're describing it, it's under our current system where we have not found a suitable replacement for jet fuel. It is the hardest thing to replace. I mean, there's lots of, if you're talking about electricity, it is. We can see how you can move from fossil fuels to renewable sources for electricity. We can see it for cars, but for air travel, that's the big one, right? So thank you for raising that.
I'm just wondering if anyone has thought of calling it a post-carbon office. The post office. Has that been said by anybody, or am I really the first one to think that?
Passing that along to headquarters. Nice. Do you think we use brackets in there?
However you want to.
All right. Like it. All right.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Glansman, and I'm one of the Divest UBC campaigners on
Yay!
campus. So as you mentioned, over the past 6 months, we've seen several prominent universities refuse divestment,
Yeah.
and I was wondering what you would say to the Board of Governors if you had the chance to sit down with them, and alternatively, what would you say to the student campaigners who have received that no?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your work, and I know it's incredibly discouraging just to get that no. U of T, where I went to school, it's frankly even worse because the U of T president struck a committee to advise him on fossil fuel divestment, and the committee recommended divestment, not full divestment, but partial divestment that actually, if fully implemented, would mean full divestment. And it was just disregarded, right? So this is really, I mean, I want to stress, this is setting Canada apart, right? I mean, we've got very, leading universities in the United States, like Stanford, that has announced, that was one of the first to join the divestment movement. They've divested from coal. We've got Oxford University that has pledged to divest from any companies invested in the tar sands, Glasgow University, and there is not a single major Canadian university that has joined this movement. So we are distinguishing ourselves here, and I think, personally, I think it's a throwback from the Harper era, all I can say is that in the US, it has been absolutely critical to have strong alliances between faculty and students. Especially at a school like UBC, where you have such an incredible sustainability faculty, such leading climate research going on. At Harvard, 100 faculty members, many of them climate scientists, signed this call for divestment. Naomi Oreskes, who is a Harvard prof and wrote Merchants of Doubt, I think her line is really, really important to bring up, where she talks about, and because she wrote Merchants of Doubt, so she knows this, that the fossil fuel companies have been waging a war on scientists, have been waging a war on academia, and that this is about students. This is about students saying, you can't prepare me for a future at the same time as you bet against it in the stock market. But it's also about faculty members going, hey, you can't fund the people who are attacking us, who are hacking our emails, this is crazy. So I would bring up that if it helps. But I would also say this, okay, that even when you get the no, you are part of a process that is changing the debate and is creating a context where it becomes more possible to get the regulations that we need, right? Because we know divestment in and of itself is not going to be the game changer, right? What this is part of a process of, it's a part of a process that creates a context where we can impose the regulations. If we delegitimize the profits, then we can regulate the sector much more easily. That's what happened with tobacco. That's what made it possible for the price of cigarettes to go from $2 to $6, and to make it illegal to smoke in buildings, right? So even when you get the no, and even if you don't ultimately get to the yes, and I hope that you do, I hope the school sees the light, you are part of the process that is getting us there. And so don't give up and be discouraged, because it's critical work. Thank you.
Thank you, Naomi, for such inspiration and to cause us to take leadership. I have a two-part question. The first is, our Prime Minister, who is open-minded and so smart, how can he be so stupid? And the second part is, how are you going to get his ear and heart?
I don't know that this is about smart and stupid, I think that we have an elite that is still very captured within a mindset that makes it difficult to take on very powerful economic interests, right? And this is why it's significant, as I mentioned earlier, that young people who sort of cut their teeth in the student divestment movement are now challenging politicians to divest, because when they do, they will be, I think, more willing to say no to the pipelines. And this is why I take a lot of heart from Bernie Sanders' campaign, no matter what happens, is because it has so centrally put the issue of money in politics and lobbying at the center of the US debate, and it has to happen in Canada too. I mean, it's so easy for us to go, oh, we're not nearly as crazy and bad as them, right? But we have a lot of work to do in terms of freeing our politicians from the interests of fossil fuel companies. I just think we have to keep pushing. The experience of the Americans, we need to learn from, right? They went through the moment we're in when Obama was elected. They were so happy to be rid of Bush. They were so relieved not to be embarrassed on the world stage. They had this smart, good-looking, president. They were no longer a laughingstock, and then they relaxed. They were like, okay, give the guy a chance, right? And that was exactly the wrong time to relax, right? Because unlike Bush, Obama is open to pressure, right? And what we've seen is that when people stopped giving the guy a chance and started getting arrested in front of the White House to block the Keystone XL pipeline and organizing, around fossil fuel divestment, that's when we started to see some ambitious climate action from Obama. So all I would say about Trudeau, and I don't think it's about me getting his ear, I think that it's about all of us getting his ear. And the most important thing we need to do is not give the guy a chance. Okay? He comes to office with his back against the wall on climate change. We just don't have time, okay? On a basic level. But the other thing is that the best gift you can give this government is pressure from below, because you know they're under pressure from above. You know they're under pressure from the fossil fuel industry to protect their profits, to bail them out, to do all of this. So you help him when you pressure him. The other exciting thing that's happened is that the NDP's going into their convention starting tonight, I believe, in Edmonton. And there's a lot of soul searching going on in the NDP about their election losses, and a lot of people believe that it's because they did not propose a very bold alternative. The reason why we wrote the Leap Manifesto was because we saw, all of us, that none of the major national parties, I'm all respect to Elizabeth May, but none of the parties that had a chance to win this election had a climate platform that was in line with the science. So we wrote this to put pressure on whoever the next government was. And nobody gave us the time of day during the election campaign, but now what's happening is that 12 NDP ridings have passed resolutions saying that they think the NDP should endorse the Leap Manifesto. It's now been endorsed by Libby Davies, no longer in office, but other sitting MPs have signed it, and it's going to be debated on the convention floor in Edmonton. And so I think that if the NDP decides that it's going to champion the Leap in the House of Commons, that will put pressure on the Liberal government too, and I hope they do. I really hope they do.
I just want to thank you, first of all, for coming today. That was a fantastic talk. My question is just one of narratives. You mentioned Germany's energy transition, which is incredible. They're 30% renewable. But at the same time, they're also 70% using non-renewable resources. And in October, their use of dirty brown coal was actually increasing. So when we look at a country that is making so much effort, so much political will to make that transition, and yet we still see that they're reliant on these resources, my question is about Canada, and should the narrative around fossil fuels be tweaked a bit, one away from, say, as much demonization as we see, to one where we have to collectively acknowledge that they may be needed in this transition? And I don't say that like theoretically, just looking at the streets and the steel glass towers. It almost seems like that is something that will happen. And what do you think about that narrative?
Mm-hmm. I don't think, I think we have to be very careful about not demonizing the workers, the people who are working in this sector. But like I said, I think we've got the problem is a model, is a business model, right? Fossil fuel companies are guided by something called the reserve replacement ratio, where they have to always have more in reserves than they have in production. So that's why, even with 5 times more carbon in their reserves than is compatible with the 2-degree temperature target, they're still spending billions more trying to look for new fossil fuel reserves so that they can beef up their reserves. So I think that we do have to change the structure in this sector, and we can't be afraid to say that publicly. The problem with the Merkel government is that they have not been willing to stand up to the coal sector, and that transition has focused on nuclear. It didn't focus on coal at the beginning, and that's changing now. So Germany had a very, very strong anti-nuclear movement and a less strong climate movement, and I think we're going to start to see those changes now because that's where the focus is. I think it's part of the sort of logic of win-win, and this is why I'm not sure the solution is that we have to be nice to the fossil fuel companies. We're pretty good at saying yes, like okay, yes, and like let's add some renewables, but I think the legacy of neoliberalism and the fact that it has been so hard to regulate corporations, that we're coming off of 4 decades of deregulation, is that it's actually hard to say no. No, you cannot dig up all that carbon, right? I think we should have a no new exploration rule. It just makes sense, right? But you know, I don't mean to demonize the people working in this sector. I think they are caught within a structure that is one that we can't live with, and that has to change. Thanks.
Apasatani, father of Sablefish, father of all women, Raven Tribe, Kanhata, expressing appreciation for the genuine and sincere acknowledgements. And really liked what you said, that it's all very well to acknowledge, but just acknowledging is radically insufficient. Wanted to ask you to speak a bit about Greece and what we might refer to as indigenous resistance in Greece to Canadian mining corporate entities, that segment of your film. Just before you respond, I had an experience here in Vancouver several years ago at an Oxfam event. There was an Aboriginal lady speaking. She had traveled to Latin America, and she said, "I have been discriminated against for being Aboriginal. I have been discriminated against for being a woman. It was my first experience to be discriminated against because I was a Canadian. Indigenous people in Latin America turned their back on me and scornfully and derisively said, Canadian." So could you please speak a bit about that segment in your film with regard to Greece and resistance to Canadian corporate mining activity? Thank you.
It's a great question. In the film, we tell the story of a community in northern Greece that is fighting a gold mine owned by a Canadian company called El Dorado. And that fight is actually going very well. I don't have the absolute latest information on it, but the last information I had, they were feeling quite hopeful. But I mean, the fact is, Canadian mining companies have maybe the worst reputation in the world, particularly in Latin America. And there is a war going on land defenders around the world. We just saw the most devastating example of this in Honduras with the death of Berta Caceres, an indigenous rights activist who was fighting a mega dam on our people's territory. And when I speak to environmental lawyers as part of my work, they tell me they have never seen the level of repression against land defenders around the world. Right? Particularly indigenous people. And it is happening with physical attacks, like with Berta Caceres being murdered in her home just a couple days before International Women's Day this year. But it's also happening with legal attacks, sort of bureaucratic attacks, where it's getting harder and harder to work. And this is particularly true in India. So we have to be aware of this. And frankly, I think it's one of the weaknesses of the Leap Manifesto, and it's something that I think that we need to fix, is that when we talk about our responsibilities as Canadians, it is not just about how we change within our country. It's also recognizing the impacts of Canadian companies outside of our country, particularly in the extractive sector. Thanks for that. I'm mindful that there are a lot of people lined up, so I'm going to start giving shorter answers. And if people could ask shorter questions, or like yes/no answer questions.
Great to hear, Naomi. Have you heard of the Hyperloop? Elon Musk's. I have a unpaid position with NASA and what's called Skytran, and it's basically a 100-year evolution from Nikola Tesla's realization that there's energy in the atmosphere. It's called magnetic energy, and I have witnessed unwinged flight in a 4-person pod at February 15th. It was called Kitty Hawk 2. So this highly efficient use of magnetic for transportation is not just an expense for the public or for municipalities, but it's a revenue generating process that can be used in the third world, cheaper than building roads, to supply all sorts of villages. And if India is looking at the project right now, and Baltimore and Paris. I'm trying to bring it to Vancouver. I have a video out under tramway pods. But if we can have a revenue and employment-centric industry without electricity, without oil and gas, without paying for insurance. We can really get out of the 20th century mentality and look at allowing people to live in, say, Langley and be downtown in 15 minutes. That's how fast it is. And it's safe. We have Google behind it. It's part of the Internet of Things. And it's a huge transition for revenue generating for the city. So it's one instance where capitalism, good capitalism, can make a big difference for the city. It's democratization of transit.
Thank you for that.
That was a short answer.
It wasn't a question.
I have a couple of things, 3 topics I'd like to touch on, and I promise to make it quick. First thing is that there was an op-ed piece. I'm from the United States. We're from Bellingham. And there was an op-ed piece in the Seattle Times that there are 9 mines that have been permitted in BC along 3 different rivers along northwest BC that will then, those mines will use those rivers to transport stuff out through the Alaska Panhandle to the waters out there. The second thing is that I wanted to mention is we're also members of IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And we believe in we believe in one big union for all workers. And I would love to join forces with the Leap Manifesto and to try to see what we can do here in the United States, or there in the United States. And the third thing is an actual question for you. Have you taken a look at Bernie's proposals? And I realize a lot of them line up with what the Leap Manifesto is talking about. And are they as doable as you're proposing in the Leap Manifesto?
Are Bernie's proposals
Economically, do they make sense? Because that's where he's being attacked right now, is that this is not doable.
Yeah. Look, it's hard as hell, right? I mean, it's really hard because this is one of the geniuses of neoliberalism is it locks the door behind it, right? And so, this is a lot of what I wrote about in the shock doctrine is how some stuff that sort of people tune out about because it's sort of technocratic, like, the fight to make central banks independent around the world, right? So that they are out of the reach of elected regulators, or even how difficult it is to change trade agreements. So there's no doubt that it's hard, but just because it's hard is not a reason not to try. He's had a rough week on that. There's no doubt. But I wouldn't count him out yet. I definitely wouldn't count him out yet. On the other side of it, the release of the Panama Papers is a bit of a gift from the heavens. It's kind of like when that bird landed on his podium. He's got like the bird and he's got the Panama Papers, right? Nature and research, my 2 favorite forces to listen to. And so I'm hopeful, and I passionately believe that Bernie's campaign is our best hope right now.
We do too.
I don't think
we do too.
I don't believe he's perfect.
No.
But I think we've been handed a lifeline, and shame on us if we don't take it, or if you don't. I have dual citizenship. I don't usually admit to this, but I have dual citizenship, so I can actually. I'm going to vote for the first time in an American election.
Thank you.
Oh, and by the way, congratulations, Bellingham, on beating the Cherry Point coal export terminal. Blockadia. 5 years.
Hi, my name is Bérangère Maya Parizeau. I'm a UBC graduate student in the MAPS program, which is a Master's in Arts in Asian Pacific Policy Studies. My focus is environmental policy in China in the context of climate change. I contacted you actually a little bit before COP21. I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Vandana Shiva on issues of globalization, water security, international trade, and the environmental crisis. The title of the film that I'm directing is called Dragon Tears, and I would still really love to have the opportunity to interview you at a later time on these same topics. I feel very passionately about what's going on. A few years ago, when I was doing my research, I started coming back again and again to the same very stunning fact that something that I never heard of before. After doing many years of research on the water crisis in China, coming to information from nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Noam Chomsky, which I interviewed in 2013, who again and again were saying that there's the possibility of human extinction with...
Can you ask a question? I'm sorry, but there's people behind you and they're not going to get a chance.
Okay. My question is basically, the carbon is coming from China to Canada. I think a lot of people don't know that. So I'm wondering, what, in your opinion, how can Canada better engage with China on different levels to help mitigate the really extreme climate collapse that's happening over there and that is really coming towards us now?
I think the best way that we can support those forces in China that are fighting very hard for cleaner air and to get off of coal, and there's been huge investments in renewables in China, is to be part of a rapid transition in our own countries, right? We have to do that because when countries that have been burning fossil fuels on an industrial scale for a whole lot longer than countries like China, when we fail to live up to our responsibilities, then we strengthen the hand of those forces in China and India and elsewhere who are saying, well, it's our turn to pollute, and why should we not do the same thing they did because it's our turn now, right? And so there are very powerful forces, as you know, in China that have won some really significant environmental victories. I think the best way that we support them is by leading ourselves. The other piece of this that I haven't talked about is that this is not only a question of switching from fossil fuels to renewables. It is also about curbing the culture of consumption that is the centerpiece of the way we live here, right? I mean, we live in a culture that has turned shopping into our primary leisure activity, and most of what we buy is made in China, right? And it is not just about flipping a switch and getting the power from renewables and everything being fine. And this really is about changing the way we live and discovering, in fact, that we can have a higher quality of life with less. Thanks. We're going to move on to the next question. Okay, thanks.
Hi, thanks. You've been a big inspiration for me. I am really interested in this idea of blockadia, and I think that the emotions that you describe are powerful in the place protective connection to place and defense of it. I'm really curious, though, about how these emotions can be used to fight against renewable energy infrastructure development, because I study controversy over offshore wind farms. Yeah. And I was wondering if you had any insight for working through a lot of public opposition to the expansion of renewable energy infrastructure.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, this is a big part of the reason why we emphasize community ownership and community control, because what all the research shows is that when there is community ownership over renewable energy, there is not that resistance. Like in Denmark, which is the world's leader in wind and was getting 40% of its electricity from wind, decades ago, they didn't experience any NIMBYism around wind farms because the centerpiece of their transition was community ownership. So that's our answer to it. Yeah.
Hello, and thank you for your talk. Thank you also for the Leap Manifesto. I'm from a country that's under extreme austerity. I'm from Portugal, and therefore it's really good to have a pathway to environmental justice that does not sacrifice social justice and work justice. But there is an industry that you don't often talk about. In fact, I've never heard or read anything from you about it. And you said not that long ago that airplanes were the biggest contributor to carbon emissions. That's not true. The animal agriculture industry is by far the biggest contributor to carbon emissions, and I would like to know your opinion on that, if possible. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. So, it is true. If we're talking about how do we reduce our carbon footprint, not eating meat, not flying, these are some of the most important things we can do. Animal agriculture is around 14 to 16% of global emissions, and fossil fuel energy is responsible for more than 60%. There are some facts floating around because of a film called Cowspiracy that has convinced people that actually animal agriculture is something like 50%, and that's not true. But it is really significant, and this is not about downplaying it. It's a really significant part. The reason why I don't talk about it as much is because I don't think you can legislate vegetarianism, and I don't tend to focus on it's not because I don't think the individual actions matter, but because I believe that we are not going to dramatically lower our emissions at the speed that we need without a focus on policy. And I think there's been a sort of a history within the environmental movement of really over-focusing on this is how you change your lifestyle, as opposed to this is how we change the rules, and this is how we change the laws. And yes, that is going to mean changes in our lifestyle, but a lot of people don't have access to what they need to change their lifestyles. They don't have access to transit, right? They live in food deserts. The other thing I just want to say, because I know we have Indigenous people in this room, is that the climate movement also can be jerks about vegetarianism and veganism and not recognizing that for Indigenous people, there is a different culture, and if we want to build alliances, we need to respect that people have different cultures, and that Indigenous people are the carbon protectors of our earth, who are fighting to keep that carbon in the ground at incredible sacrifice. And in many cases, it is about protecting the right to hunt and fish and live traditionally, and we have to respect that. So I just want to say that.
Thank you very much.
Wow, okay. You actually heard from my wife about 3 people ago, the other half of the other third of the folks from Bellingham. I want to go back to divestment for a second and then ask a question. I was in college and came out of the anti-apartheid divestment movement in the 80s, and it was the same kind of thing. We lost and we lost and we lost. We told university trustees to divest from their corporations, and then all of a sudden in 1987, we won. And comprehensive sanctions were passed over a Reagan veto, the first override of a Reagan veto. And 2.5 years later, Nelson Mandela walked out of prison. So the possibilities for what you can do are limitless as long as you fight these fights and talk about these issues. I'm a civil rights lawyer. My wife and I represent the people who do blockadia around the country. And I want to ask you, we were doing mountaintop removal cases in West Virginia, and it looks hopeless for a long time. And now Massey's gone, Arch is gone, Peabody's dying. All of these corporations we thought we could never beat are collapsing. Are we actually, in a lot of ways, starting to win?
That's a great question. That's a great question. What I'm going to say is I believe we are at the best moment that I believe we've ever been in order to win, that the stars are aligning for that great transition. But it isn't going to happen on its own, right? And I like to quote a friend of mine named Quentin Sankofa, who works with a group called Movement Generation. They say, transition is inevitable, justice is not. Right? So there is going to be a transition off fossil fuels eventually. We're having a fight over timelines. The coal companies are dropping like flies, you're right. But the oil and gas companies are fighting for their lives and for every last profitable quarter, and we're wasting precious time that we don't have. So it matters if we lose the next 5 years, right? So that's why we really are right up against it. But at the same time, as we transition, there are different ways of transitioning, right? I mean, Peabody's trying to stick the American taxpayers with the cleanup bill, right, that they've left behind. Elon Musk, the savior of electric cars, his solar city has used prison labor to, contractors who use prison labor to make solar panels, right? So we can transition in a way that replicates the inequities of our current system, right? We can respond to climate change in a way that deepens inequality. And I believe that our current system is actually built to do that. So yes, I believe that the signs are amazing, but if we want this transition to be fair and just, we're going to have to fight for that part, and we're going to have to build those coalitions. So thank you so much.
So I'd just like to end by thanking all of you for attending today. I have a number of sponsors to thank, but to reiterate on the comments that we've heard today, the divestment movement is one of the programs on campus, while the immediate response, there was a more subtle response than simply saying no to the divestment. It did force the university to think carefully about what it does next, and it created a new fund for new donors to donate into, and it inspired and encouraged many faculty, like myself, to wonder what opportunities there are to redirect our pension funds, which is also a significant endowment, and is, in my view, a much easier win in the short run than shifting the overall endowment for the university. The second thing I want all of you to be aware of is UBC's achieve and will achieve a 33% reduction in emissions this year, and has achieved 30% reductions against a 2007 baseline in 5 years. There's a process underway at the moment for planning for a 67% reduction in emissions by 2020, and that's an open climate action plan process at the moment. So if you want to weigh in on that, there's a consultation process underway that wraps up in May, and would encourage you to get involved in that. The third comment I wanted to make is somewhat of an irony on the use of the endowment. The UBC endowment has lent money for its own infrastructure projects to build green infrastructure and low emission student housing and energy distribution, a hot water to steam system, steam to hot water system on the campus that gets as good or a better return than investing in the markets.
$84 million. $84 million are going to coal, gas, and oil. Don't like.
We're not. My point is not to apologize in any way. My point is to say that the divestment debate is one that needs to continue, that isn't going to be won in one single move, it's going to be won over time. And there are great opportunities on this campus to change the way that this campus is built, to inspire next generation of leaders, and keep up the pressure. So before we close, I'd like to thank the UBC Sustainability Initiative, Peter Wall Institute for Advanced Studies, AMS Sustainability, UBC Centennial, the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions, and Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And please keep up the pressure, and join me in thanking Naomi for sharing her thoughts with us today.
Just turn it on. Naomi will be available to sign the books on the stage here. So if you like to have the book signed, please line up right here on the side.